Next on Secrets of War. As regular American units fought under rules of engagement imposed by their political leaders, unconventional special forces fought classified battles, often across the fence. Their covert missions led them deep into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Vietnam Secret Operations is next on Secrets of War.
There are many names for the wars in Vietnam. The French called theirs the War Without Front Lines. Ho Chi Minh and his faction of the Vietnamese Communist Party called it the People's War. For the Americans, it was simply the Unconventional War. The United States fought an elusive enemy with helicopters and superior firepower under stifling political and military rules of engagement. The North Vietnamese suffered grievous casualties, but outlasted the U.S. force with intelligence, evasiveness, patience, and terror. The fact that the U.S. military's superior firepower might have defeated other armies was lost in the failure to understand the political and military situation it faced in Vietnam. Southeast Asia would become an important battlefield for a new kind of army of unconventional soldiers. Led by the U.S. Army Special Forces and Navy SEALs Special Operations, with code names like Phoenix, 34 Alpha, Delta Force, and studies and observation groups are distant reminders of the secret and savage struggle for the hearts and minds of the people.
I think there's no doubt at all that the Pentagon was very arrogant during the Vietnam War. They felt that they had the technology, they had the God-given right to win the war. They had so they have political, technological, and almost philosophical arrogance, and that was a real problem.
Indeed, the expression "hearts and minds of the people" would affect how the U.S. military would remold itself after Vietnam, and it continues to be a primary focus for U.S. military operations.
The strategy or objective, if you will, of the North Vietnamese and the whole war was stated very early. They said that their objective was to establish communism throughout Vietnam as well as in Cambodia and in Laos. To do this, they didn't invent a new strategy or new tactics in which to engage the war. They recognized that their enemies were going to be strong. They anticipated they'd fought the French. They anticipated fighting the United States. Their strategy and tactics were based upon the same that Mao had used in to establish communism in China.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy took office. He directed that additional counterinsurgency special forces units, known as Green Berets, be sent to Vietnam. Their mission was to counter the Viet Cong propaganda efforts in the southern countryside.
That mission was primarily counterinsurgency. President Kennedy, who was fascinated by the whole concept of special forces, concluded that a unit that is trained to fight guerrilla warfare would be the logical ones to conduct counter-insurgency, counter-guerrilla operations.
The North Vietnamese had been preparing for unconventional warfare inside South Vietnam since 1957. developing the Viet Cong agents and networks that became increasingly successful in isolating segments of the population from the existing South Vietnamese government.
And I think that a lot of the VC's credibility in the South was the fact that this was a nationalist fight, or it was portrayed as such. And I think that was very important. There's no doubt that terror and subversion was used. That's used in any guerrilla campaign, in any civil war. But it isn't the case, as a lot of American historians would like to say, that the people in the South were totally terrorized into supporting the VC. There are very strong nationalistic reasons why they didn't like the American involvement, and they didn't like the corrupt government that the Americans appeared to be supporting.
Linked to the Green Beret presence in Vietnam was the American Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA initially was in charge of all classified paramilitary operations in Vietnam.
Those guys needed Army assets to do some of the tough stuff, some of the commando operations. So they organized an Army headquarters called the Special Operations Group. Then it dawned on them that people could figure out maybe what the Special Operations Group did, and so they retitled it the Studies and Observation Group.
And our cover story was that we were analyzing the lessons learned in joint conflict and recording these for future generations, and to learn as much as we could so that we could perfect the way in which we were fighting the war. And we were supposed to be staff officers and historians.
The Studies and Observation Group, known as SOG, remains one of the most secret operations of the Vietnam War. One of its first major counterintelligence operations would become its biggest failure.
The 34 Alpha program was a program that started when CIA was conducting all of the covert and clandestine operations in Southeast Asia. They had organized the South Vietnamese intelligence service in such a way that they would recruit people, the South Vietnamese would train them, and then the U.S. would help provide equipment, radios and so forth for their dispatch, and in some cases provide them with airlift into the north, or surface transportation by sea into the North Vietnam.
With no resident agents in place in North Vietnam to shield the infiltrators, most saboteurs were either killed or captured, usually within hours of landing. In all, 500 agents were lost. Of the nearly 400 who were captured, some would spend as much as 27 years in prison.
It was 100% unsuccessful for several reasons. One, you've got a very authoritarian regime up there that monitors the villages. There's a little mini commissar at the lowest level. And a stranger who comes in, it's not like in the South where there was considerable mobility. A stranger comes in and he's immediately interrogated. And for one thing, the agents that were infiltrated up there didn't have good credentials. The forgeries were very inept, apparently. And for that reason, they were scarfed up.
Kennedy's written direction to expand present operations in the field of intelligence, unconventional warfare, and political psychological activities was designed to keep American soldiers out of any direct combat role.
The 34 Alpha teams that went up into the north were purely Vietnamese. There were no Americans on those teams. There may be Americans in the aircraft that dropped them, but there were no Americans on the ground.
The CIA finally realized what was happening to its agents on the ground and the extent of their failure, but the damage had been done. When these agents were captured, so were their radios.
These agents were controlled and essentially turned back on Saigon, so it became quite a source of disinformation. Furthermore, they went so far as to say, we're doing fine up here in the jungle, send us some more equipment, you know, like send us your latest radio, and by the way, what's the code? Haven't we changed the code? Things like that. So it was absolutely a total failure.
Other 34 Alpha missions were conducted using South Vietnamese mercenaries. These raids involved high-speed boat attacks on North Vietnam shore installations in the Gulf of Tonkin. The raids provoked the North Vietnamese to send their own torpedo boats into the Gulf, allegedly attacking American Navy destroyers in international waters. This incident was the rationale for President Lyndon Johnson to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through the U.S. Congress in August of 1964. This resolution would become the legal basis for U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War. In 1964, with confirmed evidence of the North Vietnamese Army presence inside South Vietnam, operational control of the Special Forces was transferred from the CIA back to the U.S. Army under a program called Operation Switchback. This change brought the Special Forces intelligence gathering mission to the forefront. They realized the best way to get accurate intelligence on their enemies was to find it themselves. By 1968, Special Forces had created a myriad of classified units to satisfy military intelligence needs. Inside the Studies and Observation Group, the most successful special operation was C&C, or Command and Control.
In the early conduct of the war, it was the American